Good evening, and welcome to today's panel conversation on fair housing policies and practices. My name is Michael Delacarpini. I am a faculty member and the former dean of the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania and faculty director of the SNF Padilla program at Penn, whose mission is to facilitate robust, informed, and respectful dialogue on the many difficult, contentious issues facing the nation and the globe, and across the many ideological, cultural, and demographic divides that too often keep us from effectively addressing these issues. The panel is the third of 13 we will be holding over the course of this academic year as part of the preceptorial, which for those of you who don't know, is essentially a non-credit bearing course on racism and anti-racism in contemporary America. The preceptorial is designed for Penn undergraduates, but each panel is open to the entire Penn community and to the larger public. I'm pleased to say that we have over 200 people registered for today's event. The preceptorial is sponsored by the SNF Padilla program at Penn and co-sponsored by a number of other important Penn centers and offices, including the Office of the Vice President for Social Equity and Community, the Office of the Provost, the Andrea Mitchell Center, Civic House, and new student orientation and academic initiatives, all as part of the year of civic engagement at Penn. Now, while inspired by recent events such as the murder of George Floyd and the resulting protests, demonstrations, and calls for change that emerged from them, this series of panels discussions is designed to explore the ways in which racism has long been embedded in our country's economic, housing, public health, criminal justice, education, cultural, media, and political systems, to better understand the root causes of this structural racism, and to identify what we have or might do to address these inequalities. Today's panel focuses on the nature and impact of racism on housing policies and practices. So I should note to the audience that you can use the Q&A function on your screen to ask questions. While we won't be able to answer all of them directly, we'll leave time towards the end of today's panel for me to ask our panelists some of them on your behalf. Now, we have a stellar panel to address today's issues and your questions, who I will now very briefly introduce. So I'm asking the panelists now to please unmute their videos so they can be on screen while I introduce you. While folks are coming onto the screen, let me start. First, I'd like to introduce Penn's Provost and James S. Reapy Professor in the Law School and the Graduate School of Education, Dr. Wendell Pritchett. An award-winning scholar, author, lawyer, professor, and civic and academic leader, he served from 2009 to 2014 as Chancellor of Rutgers University Camden. In the city of Philadelphia, he's been the Deputy Chief of Staff and Director of Policy for Mayor Nutter, Chair of the Redevelopment Authority, member of the School Reform Commission, President of the Philadelphia Housing Development Corporation, Board Chair of the Community Legal Services of Philadelphia, and Executive Director of the District Offices of Congressman Thomas Follietta. He's also served as President of the Coalition of Urban and Metropolitan Universities and co-chair of President Barack Obama's Urban Policy Task Force. His scholarly work focuses on urban history, especially housing, the topic of today's panel, race relations, and economic development. Our second panelist is Dr. Amy Hillier, Associate Professor in the School of Social Policy and Practice. Dr. Hillier teaches introductory level GIS mapping courses for SP2 and the Urban Studies program, and chairs the Masters of Social Work Racism course sequence. The research is focused on historical mortgage redlining and on the links between the built environment and public health. Dr. Hillier moved to SP2 in 2017 from the Department of City and Regional Planning in the Weitzman School of Design in order to pursue new research interests related to the LGBTQ communities, particularly trans youth. She is the founding director of the LGBTQ certificate at Penn. Next is Dr. Vincent Reina, Assistant Professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning. Dr. Reina's research focuses on urban economics, low-income housing policy, household mobility, neighborhood change, and community and economic development. In 2017, he helped the city of Philadelphia develop its framework and strategy for preserving its stock of existing subsidized housing, and in 2018 worked with the City of Philadelphia to write its first citywide housing plan. He was a 2018 visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia and a 2018 Lincoln Institute Land Policy Scholar. Reina previously worked at the Local Initiatives Support Corporation and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Our fourth panelist is Dr. Susan Wachter, Sussman Professor and Professor of Real Estate and Finance at the Wharton School. From 1998 to 2001, Dr. Wachter served as Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research in the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. At Penn, she co-founded and currently is co-director of the Penn Institute for Urban Research. She also founded and currently serves as director of Wharton's Geographical Information Systems Lab. Dr. Wachter serves on the Affordable Housing Advisory Committee of Fannie Mae and the Office of Financial Research Advisory Committee of the U.S. Treasury. She, along with panelists Wendell Pritchett and Vincent Reina, is also the author of a new or forthcoming, I'm not sure if it's exactly out yet, edited volume, Perspectives on Fair Housing, published by Penn Press. Last, and certainly not least, is Marc Morial. Mr. Morial is the president and CEO of the National Urban League. As mayor of New Orleans from 1994 to 2002, Mr. Morial led New Orleans' renaissance and left the office with a 70% approval rating. Absolutely amazing. He's a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, I'm proud to say, with a degree in economics and African American studies, and holds a law degree from Georgetown University. He's also the author of The Gumbo Coalition, a collection of lessons on the power of unity in our democracy and a leadership framework for America's change makers. I should note in advance to our audience that, unfortunately, Mayor Morial will have to leave a little bit early, so he'll be with us for at least the first half of our discussion, however. So with that, thank you all for being here tonight. I greatly appreciate it. Well, I want to start by saying that while today's panel is focused on housing, and future panels in this series will focus explicitly on the criminal justice and political systems, I'd be remiss if I didn't give the panelists a chance to reflect on recent events, especially given that the topic of the entire series of panels. In particular, I'm thinking now of the recent election, which is still ongoing to some degree, and also the killing of Walter Wallace Jr. just a few blocks from Penn's campus. So I think I'd just start. We'll give you all a chance to just give a few thoughts on these or any other recent events that you'd like to address. But let me just start with Amy. And Amy, any reactions that you'd like to share about either of these or other recent events that have taken place that seem relevant to our topics?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. It's great to be part of this panel. And it's a really sad time to talk about these topics. I think white people in particular are having a real reckoning with what racism, the havoc and the violence that, how it impacts lives. And I'm here in West Philadelphia, in a predominantly white part of West Philadelphia, but feel deep sadness about what happened to Walter Wallace Jr. and to all the folks who witnessed that. And as a social worker, we'll just point out that we know this. We know that mental health, undiagnosed mental illness, makes people particularly vulnerable. And this just adds to the arguments about why we need to rethink emergency response and policing. Also just wanted to note that this week, tomorrow in particular, the world and Penn's campus are honoring Trans Day of Remembrance, which highlights the resilience and the violence against trans communities, and particularly the vulnerability of trans women of color like Dominique Remy Fells from Philadelphia, who was murdered in June. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much, Amy. Wendell, any thoughts on any of these recent events that we've been talking about?
Yeah, it is a sad time. Thank you, Michael, and everybody for participating. I'll start with something positive in a difficult time. I do think this has been a year of consciousness raising about the deep structural racism that we have had in this country and continue to have, and that's a good thing. And so being the perpetual optimist, I hope that we can build on that consciousness raising. For me, as I think about the killing of Walter Wallace, most most of my family lives in the blocks away from where Walter Wallace lived, and I spent much of my life out there. So while all of the killings have affected me, this one affected me greatly. I didn't know Walter Wallace, but I'm certain that some of my family members at least had some connection to him. And bringing this to the topic for today, I mean, the reality of many neighborhoods like far West Philadelphia is that they were deeply shaped by racial discrimination that we're going to talk about, and racial discrimination that wasn't only facilitated by the government, it was actually created by the government. So that when we think about the things we need to do to rectify it, the government has a fundamental responsibility to affirmatively engage in rectifying the decades-long, centuries-long discrimination that people of color and others have faced. And so this conversation is at least part of that effort. It's a very small part, but we have to make small steps in order to make bigger progress.
That's a great point. Thank you. Thank you for that, Wendell. Vincent, any thoughts of yours?
I mean, I echo everything that's been said thus far, and just want to add, the other layer of violence on communities of color right now is the way the COVID-19 pandemic is disproportionately affecting those communities, both through economic job losses, through deaths, right? All of these things are compounding layers on top of each other that very much connects to the dynamic that Wendell just mentioned, right? And very much at the core of what we're talking about today. So we need to just remember that these aren't singular topics, right? These are all very intimately related and very much compounding over time. And so that's why it's really important to think structurally about this. And one has to hope, if nothing else, with the recent election and someone giving, I guess, I don't know if we call it an acceptance speech or whatever happened the night that Joe Biden gave his speech. At this point, the mention of things like systemic racism and even many ways in his formal platform, ideas that are very much rooted in acknowledging these intersections is if nothing else, hopefully a moment to show that going forward we'll start actually doing something about this.
Great point, and great point about how these are all interrelated topics. As we go further into this series of panels, I see echoes of earlier panels that keep emerging, and I think that makes that point really clearly. Susan?
I think this event brings home the depredations of structural racism because it is close to home. But this is a reality that is not news for the communities for people of color in Philadelphia. So now that these depredations are so clearly, starkly relieved by these tragic events and by the pandemic more broadly, we have a chance for a reset, and we need to take this moment to do so.
That's great. Thank you. And Marc, the election more generally, or I don't even know, living here in Philadelphia, how much the Walter Wallace issue resonated across the country, but any thoughts on either of these?
Yeah, well, thank you. And I want to thank the University of Pennsylvania, Michael, and the chance to be with such a distinguished group of panelists for a good discussion today. And the Walter Wallace issue has resonated because it's yet another example of structural racism, another example of police misconduct, another example of something that could have been handled much differently, period. Exclamation point, full stop, no argument. But secondarily, I want to sound a note that, and Susan referenced this, we have a chance for a fresh start, a new start in this country. After 4 years of regression, after 4 years of division, it's an opportunity. And it's an opportunity because we do have a president-elect who has lifted up racial justice as one of the 4 pillars of his administration, a president who made some fairly significant commitments for action, a president who I am hopeful will see this as a year like 32 or 64, where there's an appetite in the country for meaningful, progressive reform. And I think our job is to provide both the continuing analysis, because the analysis helps to educate people about the antecedents and the history and the way in which intentional policies created this, but also to be architects of ideas and initiatives. And very importantly, we can't solve 21st century problems if we're only wedded to 20th century solutions. And we need the energy and the ingenuity and the intellectual firepower and the political will. And I think that the people have spoken in a powerful way. And I'll just make this point. This is the first time in a very, very long time that an incumbent president has been defeated in a one-on-one race, a heads-up race. The last two incumbents who were defeated, the 92 election, which I'm extremely familiar with, there was a three-way race. People forget that when Ronald Reagan defeated Jimmy Carter, John Anderson got 7% of the vote. And I remember seeing John Anderson at the Irvine Auditorium when I was a student at the University of Pennsylvania campaign on campus. And he was the only candidate to campaign on campus. And it was impressive to us. I didn't end up voting for him, but nonetheless, he campaigned on campus. And so this is a monumental, if you will, decision by the people of the United States to, in effect, turn away from an incumbent and take a new start. And I think we who are concerned about issues of wealth inequality and income inequality and housing policy have to lean heavily in to the opportunity that we have to try to say, let's do some things bold, let's do some things imaginative, let's truly, truly see if this moment and this movement can really be a movement of change.
That's great. That's a great thought, comment, observation. I hadn't thought about the third party issue in elections when a first term president is lost. That's a great observation. So let's get to the topic at hand then, because it's relevant to the issues that you've all been raising. I'd like to give the audience a sense of where we stand as a country right now on housing. Its availability, affordability, its effects on patterns of integration and segregation, as well as on other aspects of daily life, such as work and schooling. Just, I think one of the purposes of all these panels is to have the audience leave understanding what the problem is before we then think about what we can do about it. So whether this is a statistical picture or a picture of what it means for the day-to-day lives of people, or in individual areas that you're more familiar with, let's have a little bit of a discussion about what housing and issues of racial disparities in housing looks like in America today. And Mayor Morial, I'd like to start again because cognizant that you may have to leave us at some point. Yeah. Why don't we just start off with you? If you could just
thank you. Let me try to create a framework to be as succinct as possible, and that is, we have lost ground on housing, period. And here's what the numbers show. Let me just talk about renters for a minute, right? Some, I think the numbers are some 44% of renters in the United States, a significant portion, are paying 44 million renters. A quarter of the nation's 44 million renters paid more than half of their incomes for housing, putting them in emergency away from eviction. This is the rental market. Can you imagine 1/4 of the nation's renters paying 50% of their income for housing? And this exposes them to instability, eviction, and other economic pressures because it costs so much to have this basic necessity of life, a roof over their head. Number two, homeownership rates on an overall basis are lower than they've been in a long time. The Black homeownership rate has actually declined to a point it is almost where it was in 1968, the year the Fair Housing Act was passed. What's the fundamental issue? And many times housing people, those of us in housing, can't look at this issue separate from broader economic trends. So here's the issue. The increase in the cost of housing has outstripped the increases in median family income, period. So the cost to buy and rent goes up, but the money you bring in because you work every day has basically been stagnant now for an almost 40-year period vis-a-vis inflation. That's the nexus of the economic challenge the country faces. And it is now playing out in the housing crisis, which is now a crisis creating greater numbers of poverty and working poor. So if we can just get our arms around the fact that we have lost ground, and look, the long history of structural inequality and structural racism and redlining, and we're fundamentally ending 4 years of an administration that didn't enforce the fair housing laws, didn't enforce the fair lending laws, didn't enforce any civil rights laws, didn't even try to enforce or address or proactively create any initiatives around this. That's where we are today. And I think we have to start, and I say, because our work is in housing, our work is in jobs, our work is in broader economics, that people who want a better outcome when it comes to housing the American people have to be concerned about income, earnings, wealth, disparities, and income inequality. You know, you can't save if you don't have. You know, you can't invest if you don't have. All the financial literacy programs and financial educations in the world are not going to do much for the family that pays 50% of their income to keep a roof over their head.
That's a great observation that connects very well to some of the things we've been talking about in this panel series. Wendell, other thoughts on what it looks like now, what our housing situation is as a vis-a-vis race?
Well, I agree with the mayor and appreciate his framing. The things I would add on to try to amplify his good framing are, if you think about a place like Philadelphia, there are places that actually don't have housing shortages. They don't have enough housing. As the mayor said, the problem in the country is a lack of decent, affordable housing. Philadelphia actually has a fair amount of housing. The problem is it's not housing that anybody should be asked to live in. It's not decent, it's indecent. And the fact that we haven't been able to keep it up or produce new housing is the fundamental problem in a place like Philadelphia. Again, there are different problems in different cities, but as I think about Philadelphia, it's that we need to renovate and build affordable, decent housing so that children and families can grow up the way that they deserve. There are things that are complicated. So we'll talk a little bit more about racial discrimination in housing and neighborhood segregation, and thinking about, and that's complicated. It's a solvable problem, but it's complicated. Thinking about anti-racist criminal justice, that's a solvable problem, but it's complicated. The sad thing about affordable, decent housing is really not that complicated. It's just a matter of investing resources. We know how to build housing. We know how to build decent housing. It's just a matter of having the political will to actually do it. It's really not that complicated, which makes it even more frustrating to me that we haven't done it.
Yeah, thank you for that. We're going to talk more about solutions, but it sounds like in some ways the solution here is fairly straightforward. But we'll get to that. Vincent, anything you'd like to add about just painting us a picture? I'm also curious. I know that there's the issue of affordable housing in terms of the availability of housing, but what are some of the things that emerge from this that also lead to some of our issues of segregation and integration within cities and across the country?
Yeah, so I want to, Marc the mayor raised a wonderful point about, or not wonderful point, but a concerning point about the housing affordability crisis that existed before the COVID pandemic, right? With a disproportionate of low-income households paying a large share of their income in housing, particularly renters, particularly Black households and Hispanic households, right? We've never had a housing safety net, right? There are 3 eligible households for everyone who receives housing assistance in our country, and those numbers are even more staggering in different regions, right? I'm working on a study in Los Angeles, and they recently opened their lottery for their Section 8 vouchers, a form of housing assistance. We estimate that 580,000 households were eligible to receive it. 170,000 households applied. 20,000 were being put on the wait list. Between 500 and 1,000 are going to be offered it per year, and those are just vouchers that are being recycled. We have not invested in our housing stock. We're dealing with an old, aged public housing stock that hasn't been invested in some time, and these things compound in multiple ways. Through my own research, I've shown that energy cost burdens disproportionately fall on minority households, right? When we think of lack of investment in housing, it formalizes in multiple ways, not the least of which is it's more expensive to actually heat your home if you can at all, right? So by virtue of constraint to your choice set, you're already paying too much for housing, and then you're paying too much for low quality housing, and then your costs actually go up as a result of that, right? When we think of issues of home ownership, housing wealth equity compounds over time. The top 20% of homeowners own over 60% of the primary housing wealth. This is particularly staggering because when we look at the disproportionate difference between Black and white homeownership rates, you also see that Blacks actually have a higher share of their wealth in homeownership, right? So that means that a higher share of their wealth is in homeownership, but they're less likely to be homeowners. Their homes are more likely to be devalued, and they're less likely to have housing wealth as a result. And all this stuff just keeps compounding over time, and we haven't done anything meaningful to actually intervene in that space to correct it.
Yeah. And then if you had layer on top of that, the point that both you and Mayor Morial made that that renters are putting in 50% of their income into housing, that and there's no investment involved in that when you're renting. So it's a bleak situation without question. Susan, I know that you've worked in Philadelphia, but more broadly on these issues, any thoughts about what it looks like now? Has it changed? Sounds like it may have changed for the worse. What its implications are.
So Provost Pritchett had pointed to the lack of decent housing in Philadelphia. And that's certainly the case. And it's a case of many cities across America and neighborhoods, particularly where people of color predominate. But it's also true that we have a lack of affordable housing across the board. And this problem isn't going away. Going into the pandemic, it was getting worse. So we have, in fact, increasing demand, but the supply doesn't keep up. And as Mayor Morial pointed to, therefore, it's beginning Econ 101, prices increase faster than wages, which makes it a very difficult problem, particularly for households that cannot borrow. They do not have access to generational wealth. This becomes a self-fulfilling intergenerational a persistent problem, because if you don't have enough money to become a homeowner, then you need to rent, and paying 50% of your income on rent means you can't save. You can't save to become a homeowner, to get on that ladder where housing prices are increasing. Instead, you face increasing housing prices and rents, and therefore housing insecurity and the potential of being evicted, as 1/4 of renters are. Now, COVID on top of that, right now, 1/4 of renters are behind on their rents and are in moratorium. There is no way of making those rents up. As of the end of December, the moratorium is over. What will happen then?
Yes. Amy, anything you'd like to add to this very depressing picture that we're painting?
Yeah, I guess just underscore, I worked with our colleague Dennis Culhane on a report on affordable housing in Philadelphia in 2003. And, to the mayor's point, like, there's no sign that anything's gotten better. And to underscore that the greatest vulnerability is low-income renters. And it's not to say that homeowners are in the clear, but low-income renters. And just, in terms of what the numbers are in terms of home ownership in Philadelphia, just, pulled from the American Community Survey, that 58% of white households are living in owner-occupied properties, and only 48% of Black, 53% of Asian, and only 43% for Hispanic and Latinx. And those aren't, to Marc's point, that the point, to see those over time is concerning, particularly if there's for Black and brown communities, we're seeing a decrease. But if that's how people generate wealth and have some kind of a safety net, I share Susan's deep concern about when the moratorium is over and around evictions, just the massive disruption this is going to mean for low-income people's lives.
So can I offer some thoughts?
Please do.
Yeah,
Please.
I was going to offer the following. We worked very closely with Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi on the various CARES bills. And the HEROES Act, which died in Mitch McConnell's Senate graveyard, which I hope will be revived in January, continued the eviction and foreclosure moratoria that have been helpful to people during COVID, and we believe it ought to be extended. Now, long term, there's a couple of things I think we need to think about. And there's an idea which would take the Section 8 program and expand it to a program where you get it if you're fundamentally eligible for it, that it wouldn't limit it, that it would make it a program that people would be entitled to. I think it is an idea, a stopgap measure, perhaps, but an idea whose time has come if we're serious about addressing this systemic crisis. The second thing is, and the National Urban League has sort of championed this for a number of years through a plan we call the Main Street Marshall Plan. And that is, we believe that an infrastructure package, which is sorely needed in this country, should not be limited to traditional terms. In other words, it should not only do roads and bridges and airports and transportation. It ought to do water systems. It ought to do community facilities, schools and parks and community centers and urban communities. And it ought to have a significant dollar amount for housing, new construction, and rehab that would be leveraged. We need bold and imaginative action is what we need. And, I am just absolutely determined after spending, the 8 years running my beloved hometown, many, many years in many great policy circles and being at the National Urban League, working with Susan at the Penn Center for Urban Research, that we just have to seize this moment and demand bold and imaginative action, because we're going backwards. And the idea and I've been reflecting a lot on the year 2000, the beginning of the new millennium, because now we're 20 years into that. And the idea that 20 years hence, we'd be going backwards. We'd be losing ground when it comes to housing and wealth would have been unimaginable in the year 2000. I would have denied that it could happen, but it has happened. And so with the new administration and the members of Congress, I am just hopeful, but it's going to take voices. It's going to take ideas. It's going to take pushing. It's going to take the revival of the Department of Housing and Urban Development to be a respected, dynamic entity that has a seat at the big table at the White House. It's going to take actions at the GSEs. It's going to take a combination of things, but we cannot be hesitant to say it's going to take the investment of dollars. This is not going to happen with good intentions, serendipitous thoughts, imagining the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And the country has to recognize that this pain pains communities of color, but it pains rural America, and it pains suburban America. And there are a lot of people in the white community who are also under the fiscal and financial pressure that this concerns. And so I see the ability on this, if it's skillfully done, to do something that has broad benefits, but it's going to have a sharp focus on communities of color. But it doesn't need to have an exclusive focus on communities of color if it's going to get the political traction we need. But we who, we're the saved, I guess, and we're the choir. Everybody here works in this area. We have to recognize the moment that we're in, and we have to be vigorous in our advocacy. We have to be imaginative in our thoughts. We shouldn't be constrained by thinking, it might not work politically. I think we have to put some ideas out there. We have to push this moment, or this problem is simply going to continue to erode the fabric of this country.
That's a great set of points and a great segue into thinking a little bit about what we know about the causes. And we've actually really already started talking about this, and that makes me pleased that you're addressing all these issues together. But we've talked about income inequality. We talked about availability of housing. We've talked about some of the things that are leading to the disparities in housing and housing availability that we have. But let's talk about it in a little bit more detail, and also in a way that that talks not only about the role of class and income, but the role of race in all of this as well. So Wendell, can you start us off? I mean, what do we know about, I mean, you've already started us off in some of your earlier comments, but what are some of the root causes of this disparity that go beyond some of the things we've talked about?
Thank you, Michael. So we know that where you live affects everything about you. It shouldn't, but it does. So it affects your health chances, your chances for education, your job chances. It affects your lifespan. People who live in poorer and segregated neighborhoods live much shorter lives and much more painful lives than people who don't. And that shouldn't be, but it is. And as I did allude to already, in this area, though the story is more complicated than what I'm about to say, the federal government deserves a very large part of the responsibility for creating racially segregated neighborhoods. It started in earnest in the 1930s and expanded in the post-war period with racially discriminatory policies that forbade companies that got federal money from investing in integrated neighborhoods, required racial segregation. So people frequently talk about the choice of where to live as a private choice. It is not. It is not. The government decisions actually at the local, state, and federal level created the racially segregated neighborhoods that we have today. We have made some progress over the last 20 years on the specific issue of neighborhood racial segregation, a little bit, but sadly nowhere near enough. But what I've argued before is that because the federal government created these racially segregated neighborhoods, it is the federal government and local and state governments' responsibility to affirmatively act to promote racial and economic integration. And we've had periods where the government has at least taken tentative steps to do that. But in the last administration, not only have we not had any tentative steps, we've had opposition to even the steps. And until we own as a society our complicity and the government's complicity in creating racial segregation in communities, we're not going to solve this problem. And I know my colleague Amy Hillier has spent a lot of time studying these issues, so I would invite her.
So Amy, jump in on this.
Yeah, thanks. One thing my dissertation was about historical mortgage redlining. And I think understanding the history that this didn't just happen. And I was hoping to stick in the chat, I'm not sure I'm going to succeed, but an article, there's a new study out linking historical mortgage redlining with COVID-19 sort of prevalence. But one thing I think it's really important to emphasize is that we can't just, we can't blame 2 generations ago. Like, we have found ways to recreate, reinforce, reinvigorate racism and discrimination. So like that got us started and the momentum's there. And, and I think sort of for me, an underlying cause of all this is our ability to tolerate inequality. And W.E.B. Du Bois came to Philadelphia and came to Penn, more than 100 years ago to study, like, what's going on with the Black people? That's what the white social workers want to know. Why are the Black people not doing well? And he had some, he pointed to discrimination and said, basically the Negro problem, which is what he was asked to study, is that white people will deny their humanity, is that white people are unwilling to accept their full humanity. And to me, that's just a Black Lives Matter as a rephrasing. I think, the other thing we have to name in there is that, the private housing market is the primary deal here. Very few people get subsidized housing, and capitalism runs on inequality. Capitalism depends on inequality, and as geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, and in a video I shared in my class about racial capitalism a week ago, that, capitalism depends on inequality, and racism inscribes that inequality. Like it's an unending source of that. And I'm not saying we're going to topple capitalism, but until we are honest about the system, this is cake baked into the system. The last point I want to make is, we've talked about physical violence and immediate violence that is, we've seen, all over the news, sadly, and racialized violence and police violence. I think that the concept of slow violence or structural violence is really helpful in understanding like how we got to this place. And to think that it was systematic, over generations, systematic disinvestment in communities of color. And that took place, in terms of schools, it took place in terms of housing, it took place in terms of health infrastructure, and what happened in Flint with the lead, this takes generations to create. I'm not saying it has to take that long, but I think we need to keep in mind how fundamental some of these inequalities are baked into how we operate.
Thank you for that, Amy. Susan, anything you'd like to add on this?
Yes, I'd like to bring home and perhaps some descriptive of what this means. Wendell and Amy spoke about life chances. So we know that where you're born, the zip code in which you are born, is more important than your personal characteristics, than what college you go to, than any characteristics that are individually yours. It's simply the zip code that determines life chances. What we mean by that is where you were born and grew up affects your adult lifetime outcomes. So why would this be? And we've done work at Penn Institute for Urban Research. We have a book on neighborhood and life chances, which very careful research on health, for example, shows that asthma and other diseases are far more prevalent, all else equal, from children who grew up in neighborhoods of poverty, segregated racial neighborhoods. So these problems of housing segregation and the indecent housing that Wendell pointed to have specific outcomes 20, 30 years later, which then, of course, endure through the lack of chances of the children and the lack of opportunity and choice for the children. And it's not just in health, it's very much in educational opportunity, with schools where you can go. And I would say it's not only those, it's much more pervasive. And it's not just physical health, it's psychological health. What about what you're exposed to? What about the fact that you walk down the street and you have glass, and instead of trees, you have decline and disinvestment? What does that say about how you're valued? So we as a nation have to face this. And as Mayor Morial said, it's really quite shocking. I was in government in 2000, and actually has nothing to do with me personally, but we did actually have explicit plans in place, much too mild, much too moderate, but they actually worked. We actually decreased the gap between Black and white homeownership by 10%. So that's huge. And how did that get done? Well, there were a lot of solutions that were going on at the same time, including basically affirmative action goals on the part of the GSEs and on the part of HUD and the Community Reinvestment Act. This was when President Clinton was there. So I'm not saying that it was nirvana. It was not nirvana, because even with a 10% reduction, there was still a 20% otherwise unexplained gap. So, but we were on a path, and then we fell off and reversed, partially because of the great crisis, the great financial crisis. So President Obama came in the middle of the worst recession, nearly potentially Great Depression 2.0. And then, of course, we've had the reversal policies in the last 4 years. So we have much to do, but it doesn't mean that we cannot, but we must have intent, and we must bring all to the table to get it done.
Thank you. Thank you. Vincent,
I just want to add one element to this is I think what we've done as a society for too long is that whenever we talk about housing support or housing investment, particularly in communities of color, it often gets shrouded in conversations about government intervention in housing markets, and government shouldn't be in housing. The reality is that government is in housing. Government has been in housing for a very long time. The most real way that it is through local zoning. That is government. It decides what can be built where, right? And that is often the tool that's been used to drive investment to allow some people to appreciate wealth and others not, right? And those some people being white households and those other people being communities of color, right? And individuals of color. And so I think we have to get rid of this fallacy that, you know, any government support or investment is government messing with housing markets, right? So that's one thing. And I think that why that's particularly important, because I think that framework always results then when we do try to do some kind of support system or investment, some form of passive support or passive investment. And then all that does is mimic existing discrimination in the housing market and result in the same tool working differently for white households and Black and brown households, right? And so, so that all's to say that I think our history of how we got here also like is shrouded in a really a lack of understanding of the fact that government is very actively in our housing markets to this day, and we need to acknowledge all the ways it is and all the ways that it's perpetuating inequality.
No, great observation. Thank you for that. Morial, I want to end this session with this part of the session with you. You spoke eloquently about how issues of affordable housing cut across race, and but clearly race plays a role in this that's different, as some of the other panelists have spoken to. What's your sense of that? I mean, I'm not asking you to give me proportions, but income and class clearly matter. But how does race play into this?
Race is, you can't separate the two, but race defines the income and wealth of Black people. You know, fundamentally, I mean, if you look at income inequality and you put the racial lens on it, it becomes far more severe. And that's just basically the issue we face. And so in this moment, we've got to confront that. And we can't run from it. We can't. And that's why I've been suggesting an intentionality. And many of the panelists have talked eloquently around the way in which government, so policies, law, policies, practices, and customs created the racial wealth gap, the denial of the ability to borrow or buy or anything, and of recent, just the arrogant failure of the last 4 years to even enforce the laws that are on the books. The notion that a president comes to office and says, I'm not going to enforce these laws, or these laws, but I'll enforce these laws, is so inimical to the idea of democracy. So, you know, I think race is central to, and I believe W.B. Du Bois said that the color line was the issue of the 20th century, and I think it remains the issue of the 21st century for America. And it touches economics, it touches our life. But here's the thing for America, you know, our nation is becoming like our cities, multicultural, multi-religious, multi-orientation, dynamic, and varied. We have got to figure out how the lens of economic opportunity is real for all in the 21st century, or we are going to pay a terrible price as a nation in this century as this nation becomes more diverse. So I want to thank all of you all for having me. I've got to jump. I know you all are living on Zoom. I'm living on Zoom. I got to jump to another Zoom, but always love being at the University of Pennsylvania. And I will say, I have my son's a freshman at Penn, but he hasn't had an opportunity to set foot on campus.
Yeah.
So I'll tell him to come see you guys when he gets on campus.
Thank you so much, Morial. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, man.
Take care.
So again, you've already begun to, all of you have already begun to touch on this, but let's dive a little bit deeper on to what do we know about solutions for these issues, including solutions that haven't been tried, but that are solutions that if we were to try, you have some reason to think would work. What works in this area? Let me just start off with Susan.
So let me put a statistic out there and then go to some solutions. Mayor Morial was speaking of the racial wealth gap. Well, what is the racial wealth gap? Or what is it is? The wealth gap is mostly due to renting versus homeowning. So the average homeowner in the United States has wealth of $250,000. The average renter has wealth in the low thousands. So it's more than $250,000 difference. And of course, we know renters are just one rental payment away from eviction when they're particularly exposed to paying 50%, and in a day when rents are going up, even leaving aside the pandemic. So home ownership is important, but it's been going in the reverse direction. That is, home ownership gap, which was in fact decreasing. What is that gap? It's a gap of about 30%. So white households have about a 75% home ownership rate, and Black households have in about 45%, changing a bit, but that's 30%, and that's been pretty persistent, as I said, except for this one period in time earlier. So how do we, is there a way of attacking these persistent problems that lead to persistent generational inequality? And just as the mayor said that we got here through laws, policies, and programs, we can, in fact, make progress and use the diversity of our nation, the fact that we will be a majority-minority nation, as a cause for celebration, as a cause for growth, as a cause for all of us to be better off as we share in our new and growing prosperity. How can we do that? Can we be specific? And I will be. For example, one of the major reasons that people cannot become homeowners is they don't have a down payment. And they don't have parents who have, or they may not be homeowners, they certainly may not have wealth. Where's the down payment? Other countries have down payment assistance programs. That's one thing that we could put into place that could overcome this huge gap and can put people on the ladder of building wealth the way most American households do build wealth, through home ownership. That's one example. Another example is through the mortgage market. The mortgage market is seemingly perhaps neutral, race neutral. It is not race neutral. Minorities pay more for mortgages. And in fact, policy changes of recent years have reinforced this problem, but they can be reversed. These are technical issues. They're issues of the structure of the mortgage market, the role of government-sponsored enterprises. Government-sponsored enterprises, and Ginny May, this is called the secondary market, are responsible for 70% of the mortgages in America. They have a duty to serve, but the duty to serve all people, including people of color, has not been first and foremost. But now, President Biden has one of his pillars, racial justice. It can be and should be, and we can make a difference. Coming out of the Great Recession, we raised rates for minorities effectively, making it harder to become homeowners. That can be reversed and undone, despite the fact that the higher rates were not reflective of increased risk. Quite the contrary. Third, and just I'm going to say quickly two more. One is the voucher program. We certainly can redo voucher. Vince can speak to that much better than I can. And in addition to that, we have the potential of actually going back to our fair housing laws, as we speak to in our book, Perspectives on Fair Housing, and enforce the law, affirmatively furthering fair housing across America. So I'll leave it with that.
That's great. And Vince, you were brought into this. What would you add as potential or actually effective solutions to some of these issues?
Sure. So as I said earlier, and very well stated by the mayor, is that, you know, we have no housing safety net, and there's a proposal on the table to essentially make everyone below 30% of AMI eligible for a Section 8 voucher, right? Instead of creating this crazy lottery system that creates horrible incentives and winners and losers, right? That's not the sole solution, but that's something that is important to do, and also financially feasible. We've done some of the math of what that would cost. And again, as Provost Pritchett said, this stuff is a matter of will, right? It's not that we can't do it, it's that we just have to put the dollars towards it, right? And make it a priority. I think we have to move away from kind of passive means of addressing gaps and be very active. So going back to the voucher, in the city of Chicago, Black households live in neighborhoods with 9 percentage point higher poverty rates than white households using a voucher, right? So two similar households, similar incomes, only difference between being Black and white, and they're accessing fundamentally different neighborhoods with respects to poverty rate, right? You look at a place like Dallas, there's an organization called the Inclusive Communities Project that works with households, helping them find units, providing legal support, all of these kind of things. They've been able to significantly narrow that gap, right? That's a significant active support system that makes that safety net work equally for everyone, regardless of your race, right? And that activeness needs to extend beyond that. Like Professor Wachter just said, you know, we need to be proactive about fair housing, affirmatively further it, right? Under the Obama administration, there was a mandate to essentially create plans to affirmatively further fair housing, to promote municipalities actually proactively thinking about these issues structurally, to incentivize them with financial resources and rewards to actually do this, and to hold them accountable throughout the process of actually doing this. And I would say the last bit is we should acknowledge that there are serious gaps in the credit market, right? For small owners of small properties, right? So we look at the COVID rental problem going on right now, a huge challenge of evictions, but there's also a lot of owners of small multifamily properties who can't actually access credit and are also actually now not receiving rent payments, and therefore are more likely to have their units leave the housing stock, which furthers our housing affordability problem, right? So we need to acknowledge the need to support tenants, to invest in properties, and to acknowledge where market gaps actually exist, because they do. And you can actually create products that do that, right? So in Philadelphia, they created a mortgage insurance program aimed towards investing in small multifamily properties, saying if this defaults, we'll take the risk. And you know what? A lot of those properties actually aren't defaulting. So there's actually not that much risk there. You just need someone to guarantee that, right? So there's a lot of mechanisms in here that are small and large that relate to investment and also more significant planning, but all in the context of very active action.
That's great. That's great. One of the questions we've got from the audience is, this is great, but tell me some specific solutions. And you and Susan have really begun to do that. Thank you. Amy, what would you like to add to this in terms of what works, what might work?
Well, I just want to say thank you to Susan and Vincent for having all those specific ideas right at your fingertips. That was pretty amazing to hear about. I guess an underlying principle, you know, housing is going to need to be subsidized for low-income households. Let's be deliberate about who needs the subsidy. So, you know, if I just look at myself in terms of the kind of subsidy I get, being a, you know, upper middle income, you know, faculty member at Penn, you know, subsidized with, you know, through homeowner mortgage tax credit, right? You know, and I think like that sort of like thinking, like people don't like to think about like that I'm getting a you know, that I'm getting a tax break. But like that, we have to change the way people think. We have to stop pathologizing poverty, you know, make it clear that this is just the way our system is created, and be really willing to put, you know, to focus on equity and to focus on where there is need. And, you know, and I think is the voucher program underscores the need is particularly with low income renters. I'm also was really inspired by Elizabeth Warren, and I don't know if anybody caught her talk to the Fells School 2 weeks ago. It was just brilliant. But, you know, some of it is about subsidizing housing costs, but the other things like what makes housing unaffordable, low wage jobs, right? So a minimum wage, canceling student debt. I'm really excited about what she's saying about that. For, you know, that's something that keeps low and middle income households from being able to, you know, to afford housing and to pay off a mortgage, you know, access to childcare, access to health insurance. We need all of these things. Affordable housing doesn't make sense without that full package.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. And Wendell, you right at the beginning of this panel began to talk about some of the ways in which these issues can be addressed, but what would you like to add in terms of workable remedies for some of these issues?
I do think that Vincent, Amy, and Susan really covered the panoply of great things that we can do, some of which we already did. So I want to just reinforce them. And what I'll do very briefly instead is kind of amplify what Amy said by telling a quick story. So when I graduated from law school, I came back to Philadelphia and I worked at an amazing place called Regional Housing Legal Services. And what we did was we represented community groups that were building affordable housing. And it was deeply rewarding work, and it remains deeply rewarding work. And I can walk around the city and see affordable housing projects that I worked on, and I'm proud of that. But as I became an academic, I also became cognizant of the challenges of building affordable housing are extremely large, and they require both grassroots work that CDCs are doing and commitment from, again, I know I'm repeating myself, but local, state, and federal governments of resources and regulatory frameworks that my colleagues just mentioned to actually be effective. And we need a significant increase in resources and regulation from the government. And so what I would call on people to do is to really demand that and understand that unless we have that kind of commitment, we're not going to be successful. And just a real quick history lesson. So community development corporations came out of the Housing Act of 1974, which created the Community Development Block Grant Program. And when I teach my urban history class, I tell the students that the community, that act actually was approved by bipartisan agreement. And it's an interesting story because both Republicans and Democrats disliked the current plan. So how did we do urban policy in the post-war era? We had urban renewal, which was very problematic. And we had public housing, which actually I would argue is a partial part of the solution, but we've given up on it. And so in the early 70s, both Democrats and Republicans, the left and the right, kind of threw up their hands and said, the federal government is just a failure and we can't do anything about this. And they kind of threw it back to community development corporations, which again are wonderful things. Some of my best friends run CDCs. But that was a mistake. The federal government has to make commitments, significant commitments to actually do this work. And so what I would leave, and this is really just amplifying what my colleague said, is that we have to demand that our government do the work of creating the equity that everybody deserves.
That's great. And it's actually another good segue into some of the questions. We've gotten some great questions from the audience. We'll only be able to answer a few of them, but one of them, and a theme that ran through a few questions, is we're all talking about we just have to have the will. There's some doubt out there, at least among the audience, as to whether our government has that will, and whether our media has the will to keep this as a front burner issue. I don't know if any of you have any thoughts on what it would take to do that, or do you still remain optimistic that with a new administration that will be the case? But there's some real questions out there about whether we will in fact have that will. Any thoughts by any of you as to why we should be optimistic, or what we need to do to make sure that will remain strong?
Well, real briefly, I do want to highlight something Susan said earlier. We made progress in the past on this with a government that cared. I also agree with Vincent that I think that the incoming administration has framed these issues in a better way. That's just the start. So I want to come back to one thing that Vincent said that I think people can also do, which is demand that their local governments enable affordable housing to be built and enable racial integration to happen. So we can own that, right? When we interfere with housing developments and say, well, I don't want it in my neighborhood, that prevents things from happening. I actually think that with the current administration, incoming administration, and with other administrations, we can make progress. But that's something that we actually should own, because that's something we can do something about.
So we also got, thank you. We also got a question that's more technical, and I'm not even sure that I can express this well enough, but it suggested that there were some efforts to think about ways of assessing ability to get a mortgage by not using FICO scores and that there were some other ways that are in development as to how we might think about what's a safe loan and who might be eligible. Is that something that any of you can speak to? Does that
Yes,
resonate?
I can speak to
Susan
that,
can.
Michael. It is technical, and the person asking the question, it's a great question, because FICO scores are now being used in ways that they should not be used, and effectively they are cutting out of the market lower income households, predominantly people of color. This is a time when mortgage rates are historically low. And therefore, it's a time when the housing market is doing extraordinarily well. People are taking advantage of the low mortgage rates to become homeowners because mortgage rates are at historic lows. But at the same time, the requirements to be approved for a mortgage have been ratcheted up. And one of the major requirements is through the FICO score. And this is simply because there hasn't been paid sufficient attention to alternatives. The FICO score technology that's been in place is a decade old, and there are ways that we can, in fact, use alternative information, more information, to increase access to mortgages. But again, there needs to be the policy in place to do this. There needs to be a focus to saying that we're going to be, in addition to maintaining safe and sound mortgage markets, we also have a duty to serve, and we will take that seriously.
That's great. That's great. I knew somebody on the panel would be able to answer that question. Thank you, Susan. I'm going to combine two questions that were both kind of framing questions to keep this issue on the agenda and to draw support for it. And the questions are basically, would either a human rights frame or a reparations frame work in regards to generating attention and the will to act on these? Both can be complicated and controversial, but I wondered if anyone had any thoughts about thinking of housing as a human right, or the issue of thinking about getting to greater financial equality through some kinds of a reparations program. I mean, that could also be something that you might think makes some sense, but is politically unlikely to happen. But just any thoughts on those as frameworks?
I don't know that I have any really thoughtful things to say on those really important questions. I think immediately I'm thinking about the political viability of both frameworks. But I would say in terms of reparations, in terms of racial reparations, like if not now, then when? Like that seems to be a really smart strategy, and things that didn't seem possible a year ago might be, and I'm not sure how long this window will last. I'd be really excited. I wish we were having an exchange in person, because I'd love to hear the person who asked the question maybe has some thoughts about. I haven't thought a lot about what reparations would look like in the context of housing.
I would just add to this. We've very long tried to make the kind of economic justification for investments in housing, right, as having local, regional, macroeconomic effects, right, as being cost effective, all of these kind of things, and it seems like, if nothing else, in the last administration, like those arguments clearly didn't matter, right? It almost as if like we felt like if we made those economic cases so firmly, eventually everyone would buy in, right? And I think that's one thing that's clear, is the element of just will that we keep talking about, and the element to just make that decision and do that thing and show that priority. I think is of the utmost importance, because we know the economic value and importance of all of these things. This is well documented. This is well stated, right? And in the last administration, President Trump actually reduced the benefit of the home interest mortgage deduction, which was actually meant to be like a fairly progressive policy, because we know that subsidy doesn't increase homeownership rates. It only increases the size of home someone purchases, right? but that money then didn't go towards some other program that would form investments that would lead to better returns, right? It just went back in other people's pockets in other forms, right? And so all to say that I do think in hearing your comments, there is a lot of importance for us to kind of feel very comfortable framing these topics as issues of justice, as issues of equity, and doing those things and not just relying on economic rationales for doing these things now more than ever.
That's a great way to put it. That's an excellent way to put it.
Can I add just real briefly, Michael?
Yes, please, please.
So I agree with Amy and Vincent on this. I just add that the United Nations does define affordable, decent housing as a human right. I mean, so that is true, and it is the appropriate framework to think about it. And then in terms of reparations, I point out, and I'm going to admit that these are small examples, but the Community Reinvestment Act really is a reparations. It's acknowledgement that that banks removed assets from neighborhoods, from Black neighborhoods, and that they have an obligation to invest assets. Now, hasn't been enforced very well. And actually, we've talked frequently about affirmatively furthering fair housing. That provision is also acknowledging that the government created the problems that we have, and governments at all levels have an obligation to fix them. Now, I would argue that's a 1% reparations act, and I think the question envisioned much broader than that, and I support much broader than that. But I do think that we shouldn't be defensive. My point is we shouldn't be defensive about those frameworks.
Yeah, I mean, and you actually make a great point that is almost the reverse of what I think the questioner was asking, which is, we can think about reparations as a way of framing these kind of programs, but we can also think about these programs as a way of addressing reparations, even if you don't use that term. So it's a really, I like that. I like that approach. Last question. It's a very, I think, straightforward one, but if you have any particular thoughts on it, even though there's some optimism for the possibility of addressing some of these issues and some clear solutions that have been put on the table, how does the fact that we are in a period of increased unemployment and hard to know how long this is going to last, how much does that complicate the very issues that we're trying to deal with right now? Is it becoming, or will it become, an even bigger problem because of the number of people that are unemployed, underemployed right now?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's the answer.
But it's not out of our control. It's all related to, in fact, our will and what we can do. So we are about to enter, obviously, into winter, but it could be a very dark winter, not only because of the pandemic's resurgence, but also because a number of the policies that helped in the end of the summer and through the fall are over. So unemployment insurance, assistance for furloughed workers, those are all over. And assistance through the original CARES Act to state and local governments. State and local governments, whose expenses are, of course, increasing, and the requirements to assist and are increasing, are going to have to start layoffs and firing folks. And that's going to affect the ability to serve populations, as well as it's going to put us into a kind of doom loop of increasing unemployment with macro effects of coming out of the recession. So we can reverse this. We can in fact have policies that will be win-win, macro policies that support state and local governments and bring us out of the recession. This is going to require cooperation and will, and it's not necessarily a doable thing. So I am actually quite worried about whether we are going to be able to get the obvious solution, which is assistance to the government that can't print money, which is on the ground today, and that's state and local governments, for example, the city of Philadelphia.
That's great. Yeah, excellent point. I'm sorry to say we're out of time. This has been a great conversation. I would like to encourage members of the audience and panel members to attend our next panel in this series, which will be the first of two panels focusing on issues of health and wellness disparities, clearly related to what we've been talking about today. The panel will take place on Tuesday, December 8th from 5 to 6:15. We'll be sending out notifications about it as we approach that date. But we have another great set of panelists, including J. Margot Brooks Carthen, Associate Professor of Nursing, John Jamot, Kenneth B. Clark, Professor of Communication and Psychiatry, Lisa Lewis, Associate Professor of Nursing, Kayshawn Spencer, the Robert S. Blank Presidential Associate and Professor of Philosophy, and Howard Stevenson, Constance Clayton Professor of Urban Education. So with that, I'd like to thank our panelists for what I think was a great and informative discussion, and our audience for attending and asking great questions. Ask you all to enjoy the rest of your evening, and I hope to see you at some of our future panels. Thank you all very, very much.